Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, Stories from the 78. The best thing about doing this podcast and website is that I get to talk to people from all over the world. And if you've watched the news the last few weeks, you know that there's been talk about the National Guard coming to Chicago. And for a variety of reasons, if you believe it or don't believe it, there's plenty of thoughts on either side. But the one thing that I think a lot of folks might miss is that if they do come, what impact does that have? Does it further set back certain neighborhoods that are trying so hard to come back from things that happened 40, 50 years ago? It's an ongoing debate, right? And I am talking to an author that wrote a book about growing up in poverty in Atlanta, being a complete dropout of school, being in gangs, to having a PhD and now an author, in talking about how people have lifted him up throughout his life when things were bleak and even pondering whether or not he should be here on this planet. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Terence Lester, who has a PhD. He's a fantastic human, and he joins me now for this story from the 78 by way of Atlanta. Doctor, how are you?
It is really exciting to be here. Very grateful to hold space with you today.
Absolutely. You're going to not only hold space, but you're going to hold part of the city with me here on Tuesday coming up at a bookstore in the Southport neighborhood, right?
Yeah, on Tuesday, I'm actually doing a book signing and talk at Three Avenues Books, which
Mhm.
I'm really excited to be there. There's actual, I think, native of Chicago that will be moderating the discussion, Jeffrey Beckham Jr. He leads an organization there called Chicago Scholars.
Very cool. And you're going to be talking about your book, From Dropout to Doctorate, Breaking the Chains of Educational Injustice, which comes out, I believe, on the 9th, which was what, 2 days ago?
2 days ago. Been out
Yeah,
two
how's that
days
going?
already. Man, you know what? Writing a book is the best worst thing ever.
Hmm, I can
And
imagine.
yeah, what I mean by that is just it takes a lot of grit, resilience, vulnerability, the bearing of one's soul to get through the process, and then you go through the editing phase, and hopefully for it to land on someone's show. So I went through the journey. It came out, and I'm excited. I've had a lot of great responses so far, and I'm hoping that it encourages people to see people who come from neighborhoods and communities like I came from as being worthy of having educational equity.
And you grew up in Atlanta, correct?
Yeah, grew up in Atlanta proper.
Hmm.
So normally when people say I'm from Atlanta, they may talk about the
Like Cobb
outskirts,
County.
right? Cobb County, Alpharetta, Dunwoody, things like that. But Atlanta is a very popular city, and people just want to be associated with it. But hey, I grew up on the southwest side of Atlanta in a community close to the Ben Hill community, but off a specific street called Campbellton Road, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. But yeah, I grew up in Atlanta, been here my entire life, and also do my work through an organization here.
Yeah, you started a foundation with your wife, is that right?
Yeah, her name is Cecilia.
Oh, that's my
We
mother's name.
actually just Oh, dope. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw yeah. So we actually just made 19 years of marriage, if you can believe that.
Congrats. That's
But
amazing.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we co-founded an organization called Love Beyond Walls, and basically that organization advocates on behalf of people who are unhoused and experiencing poverty of some sorts.
And you mentioned earlier, bearing your soul, writing a book and putting yourself out there, which has got to be exhausting on many levels, and you mentioned a little bit of that even when we got on the call, before we even started recording, like you mentioned you're doing good, but also kind of just exhausted, if I'm summing it up. And anybody can look at the news and see what's out there, which could be exhausting for anybody if you pay attention to it. And when it's up in your face, for people in Chicago right now, especially, you have the president talk about sending the National Guard here, and he's not sending the National Guard. I would imagine he's not going to send them to downtown. He'll send them to neighborhoods that perhaps will do more harm than good. And you see that in history repeating itself, because the National Guard was here back in the 60s, and when there were things on fire and there was craziness in Chicago for what one reason or another, they were here. But those neighborhoods face many issues without the National Guard being there. And that's why people don't want them there, because it could set it back further. But I imagine that vulnerability that you talked about earlier and putting yourself out there, you face that every day growing up in the streets of Atlanta.
Yeah, man. Thank you for naming that. I think it's very important that in discussions that we have an opportunity to hold both hope and the tension and or sorrow of the present moment, right? Speaking politically, there are a lot of things being spoken rhetorically with political and social rhetoric around the targeting of communities that have been historically marginalized. And that
Mhm.
does a number of things. One, it just upholds the social stigma of people who are also what I would define as the beloved community, using Martin Luther King's language, since you
Sure.
referenced the 60s. Um, it upholds stigma, right? The idea that to be black or brown, or to come from a community that has been concentrated historically with poverty, is to somehow to be synonymous with criminality, right? And this urgent message of we need to move in to kind of take back a community and to be saved from or rescued from the community that's always present. And
Hmm.
upholding that stigma is dangerous. And one of the reasons why is because it stokes fear, it stokes distance between communities, and it just intensifies a narrative that we don't know how to be together, right? Or to
Mm.
coexist together. And there's no peace in that. And the second
No.
thing is this, it further disadvantages people. And I do come from a community on the southwest side of Atlanta that is similar to many neighborhoods around the U.S. that has been concentrated with poverty. I mean, you talk about Oakland, you can talk about Detroit, you can talk about Baltimore, you can talk about the south side of Chicago, you can
Hmm.
talk about Oakland, you can talk about a lot of these neighborhoods. And when you talk about them, you can't talk about them without referencing history, right? And
Absolutely.
asking the question, how were these communities historically marginalized and also concentrated with poverty? And you can't do that without talking about redlining. And so I did
Hmm.
grow up like that. I grew up in the city of Atlanta, and right now our city, I mean, obviously it's very diverse, but there are still street names and highways that were used to divide communities. Right, you go up north, there are more wealthier communities that have access to the best schools, privatization of schools, the best communities, the best housing, the so on and so forth. And then when you do the research of how the city was designed, the city was redlined in a way that concentrated the community that I came up in and many other communities that had a higher population of Black people, and they were impoverished. And I know we'll talk about our book, but I want to state this, that in many instances, um, the way that communities are designed and were designed intentionally
Hmm.
also connects to education, because housing and education go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And for folks that may not be completely familiar with redlining, if you would just explain a little bit of that.
Yeah, basically, redlining is a federal policy that came out in the 1930s, where maps in cities, right, were labeled, and lines were drawn around communities and labeled hazardous, or they denied mortgages, right,
Mhm.
for Black people to move and access certain neighborhoods. And when you were actually denied of those mortgages, banks refused you. You actually were pushed into what would be considered red zones, right? And when you think about it, when you uh, connect housing to education, schools are actually largely funded by what? Property taxes, right? And
Yep.
so when you're living in a certain neighborhood, that means that the housing or the property taxes that does not generate enough income, and you have schools that are impacted by that. Maybe it's overcrowded classroom, outdated textbooks, right? Fewer courses, fewer support instructional teachers, fewer access to social workers and counselors, outdated books. I still remember the neighborhood that I grew up in, and I can visually see in my mind, just based on memory, the dilapidation of the buildings. The buildings weren't up to date. The community I grew up in was largely a food desert, right?
Hmm.
There's certain types of divestment. You don't have access to more advanced classes. All of these things is impacted by the neighborhoods and the housing that you grow up with. And then the last thing I'll say before I pass it back is access to housing is also about generational wealth, right? If you live in a vibrant community, you're also building equity, and those property taxes are used to have, where you're able to reinvest in schools, where you're able to get students in those types of neighborhoods access to more advanced courses, higher educational counselors if you want to select a career path. All of those things, while building wealth, is really kind of cultivated in neighborhoods that aren't necessarily cultivated with poverty. And so, I just wanted to kind of name that, and I
Hmm.
thank you for asking me that, because this persisted. And then, redlining was actually outlawed in the 60s. It was deemed inhumane. And so the laws kind of actually changed, but the results and the residue of that, right, still persists. I still can go to the neighborhood I grew up in and see the effects of what redlining did to that neighborhood years and
Oh,
years and years later.
oh yeah. I think there's a neighborhood in Chicago Roseland is a neighborhood in Chicago, among many others. But Roseland is kind of like the neighborhood where that kind of stuff happened. And it's a huge neighborhood, and it's still recovering from that, as you
Mm,
mentioned. And it's not just Roseland, it's the Pullman neighborhood, it's Woodlawn, Jackson Park. And then on the west side of Chicago, same thing, Austin neighborhood. And it goes on and on. And those things, those not simple things, but a stroke of a pen, if you will,
mm.
had so much makeup of how a city has grown over the years, since the 30s up until now. Atlanta, specifically Atlanta, though, because Atlanta was a small town back in the 30s, and now it is this
Yeah.
bustling metropolis that is Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, it's huge, but it's still, those growing problems have become, evident, as you mentioned. And in your story itself, you were involved in gangs growing up, and you were a
Yeah.
dropout, and then you found your way. Like, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of that story, because you don't people have seen movies, with, and Hollywood makes it all Hollywood, and it's all rosy, and like,
Yeah.
like the white lady goes into the inner city school like Michelle Pfeiffer in like Dangerous Minds and turns it around, but like that's that's a very
Yeah, that's
sanitized story, right?
yeah,
So you
yeah,
have a story that you were compelled to write, you put it down on paper, and all due respect to that story, but this is your story. And that's why I was compelled. You asked me why I was compelled to even want to talk with you, and that's kind of it. Like, as we're talking about it, and you're mentioning all these things, to hear it from somebody who experienced it, I think is the best education a city, that doesn't know, or people that do know that want to learn more about how to get through it, is the best way to do this. So, your story of being on the other end of where you are now, I mean, probably a complete 180, being involved with gangs and not being in school to now being an author. You have a PhD. I mean, you've turned the tide, as they say. So I would love to hear a little bit of the story and how it weaves in and out of your book.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Wow. Thank you for the nod towards a movie. I hope that one day I am able to walk with my children in a movie theater and see my story turned into a film. So I caught that indirect nod. But it is, as you said, it is not romanticized, right? It is not um, something that is easy. I normally say to people when I go and give talks that I traveled a long way to get here.
Mhm.
I traveled a long way to get here. And I'm not talking about by vehicle, by plane. I'm talking about the grit, the sadness, the trauma, the poverty, the hardship, the lack, the inequities, the injustice, all of those things. It takes a lot to overcome all of those odds. Man, I remember just being so overwhelmed with just the trauma from the environment that I was growing up in. And there's research, or one researcher, Dr. Knowles, she argues that we shouldn't be separating the term trauma from poverty, because poverty is traumatic itself. It's
Mm.
traumatic when you don't have anything extra to eat. It's traumatic when you have to deal with urban households, visually seeing dilapidation in buildings or potholes in the street, or growing up in a food desert, or maybe being in a neighborhood that is proximate to air pollution because a factory chose your neighborhood to plant these things in that actually in turns affects your health, right? Uh,
Mhm.
it is it is traumatic when you see your mom working 2 and 3 jobs, and the absence of her presence because she's trying to provide harms you in a way that you can't even articulate as a child. And so, when even in my book, I'm arguing that historical or systemic oppression or injustice creates or informs the injustice through policy. You mentioned the stroke of a pen, and
Mhm.
policy itself creates the social living conditions. Those social living conditions produces the trauma, and that trauma can create educational outcomes that are sometimes not favorable, right? For students like me, where I found myself going to school not even motivated because the teacher was communicating a lesson, but it did not necessarily speak to my existential realities. And it's not that I did not have the potential or the brilliance or the I- the actual skills to accomplish and complete the work. It's that I was carrying so much based upon the environment and the connection to um, what created those conditions I was going through. And so I did find myself dropping out of high school, running away from home, experiencing homelessness. I did find
How
myself questioning if, I needed to continue uh, moving forward with life. I was 16,
that's
17 years old, man. Bro, I remember when I run away from home. At one moment, I was staying from friend's house to friend's house, and sometimes in the park, and sometimes getting myself up to go to school as a high school student, and trying to find the courage to sit in a classroom. Right?
mm.
Um, I,
How did
my
16
go,
years old you're doing this?
yeah, 16 and a half years old. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Also dealing with it's not just historical trauma, but it's personal trauma, right?
Mhm. Sure.
Because you can have family conflict that produces these things, and that can be compounded with what the pressure from all of the decisions that were made by the stroke of a pen that places pressure on your family, all of those things. And you have all of these different dynamics, and even when I reflect back, I don't think I had the articulation of it, but I had the weight or the experience of all of that in my body, in my mind, and everything that I was journeying through. But there came a turning point.
And what was that turning point?
Well, it was a couple of things. I talk about in the book. The day that I decided to drop out of school, I had floated around from high school to high school. My mom was working really hard to try to find a school that would fit and make me feel safe enough to show up to school and really connect. And I just couldn't do it. And I ended up at an alternative school. It's in College Park, named Frank McLaren.
Hmm.
And one day I go to school. I'm so emotionally traumatized just by, all of the decisions, family conflict, the neighborhood, all that stuff. I get up from my desk. I walk out the front door of the school because it was an open campus. You could leave at will. It was self-paced. And three of my friends followed, and we're walking down the streets, not even 100 yards away from the school. A man experiencing homelessness called over to our group. I was the only one to respond. I walk up to this guy, and there's trash hanging from his beard. Like, he said he hadn't showered in weeks. And he says, "Young man, I don't want anything from you," which was, I was like, wow, I was like, well, what's going on? And he says, points at a school behind us, and he says, "Is that your school back there?" I say, "Yeah, yes, sir." And he says, "Whatever you do, don't stop getting the education. One day you're going to be a leader." This random stranger
Wow.
tells me this, and man, I feel the chills now, even on my arms. But for some reason, that disruption was so catalytic. It caused me to ponder my worth, my value, my contribution. That eventually led me to talking to my mom to get me back into school after I'd spent months just not going to school, dropping out.
Mhm.
As a fifth year senior, and my high school allowed me to come back as a fifth year senior. Most embarrassing time in my life. I was sitting in Miss West class, 10th grade geometry class, fifth year senior. And I would just go to class. I understood the work, and I was just really despondent. I had no margin for error. Like this is it. Like, you can't fail any classes, you can't
Yeah.
miss any. And
No
she
pressure.
sees me. Yeah. She
On
sees
top
me
of
and
the
she
trauma,
says,
right?
yeah, on top of the trauma, she says, "I want you to use my room as a sanctuary because I believe you're a young, black, brilliant student, and you're going to be a leader." And Miss West became a champion of mine and motivated me, even on the days when I didn't have courage or confidence in myself, to see education as a possible vehicle, along with my mom, as a possible vehicle for me to overcome a lot of my struggles. And she was the reason I graduated high school. My mom was the reason I stayed in college and continued to press forward, because she eventually overcame and got her doctorate degree. But man, it's so many
Wow.
different people who came into my life at the right time, who were strangers that spoke words to me that I just so happened to listen and gravitate to. And I have many more stories like that.
My goodness, and I think that the term that I think you've used is education is no longer just a talking point anymore; it's a battleground. That exactly, this story you just told me is a prime example of that. Just that what education can do for people is give get them where they want to go in life. It's just a matter of how much where you can find it, and if it's in your neighborhood, and fighting for the right to have it.
Yeah. It's so important, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
like, it's, when I say battleground, people are like, that sounds like real scary, or whatever, but it truly is. You know, education affords you so many opportunities. It's a privilege. Sometimes I'm out with my friends talking about what book are you reading, or what research are you looking at, or what article, what journal article have you read? You know, have you looked at this, that this is going on, right, etc. There are some people who are so stressed out by poverty, because poverty isn't just economics, right? Poverty is
Hmm.
social, poverty is environmental, poverty is occupational, poverty is spiritual, poverty is psychological, poverty is physiological, poverty is emotional. Poverty is so many different things, and some people don't have the margin or the privilege to even consider, what can I learn? What can I learn?
Right. You're just
And
getting
then
through it.
you're just getting through it, and then you add in policy, funding cuts, uh, you know, uh, rolling back certain things that will impact people who are in historically marginalized or communities that's concentrated with poverty. And then what do you have? You have someone who, like myself, with so much trauma, or uh, you know, just overwhelmed from what you're journeying through. You shouldn't be like considering dropping out before you're dreaming about what you can become, right? That's what
Right.
I'm saying,
And that's
right?
happening a lot, not just in Atlanta, but across our country, especially with everything that's been going on in public, without getting too political. But,
Yeah.
people are cutting the Department of Education in just with a stroke of a pen. Like,
1300, yeah, 1300 jobs gone earlier this year, and I I mean, we don't even have to label it uh, politics. It's just, do we care on a basic human level about the flourishing of all people?
mhm,
And when we say all people, specifically those who come from communities like mine, my story should not grab your attention because it shouldn't be a rarity, right?
right.
Um, but it is, and it is because I had people like Mr. Eason, who was a real estate developer, who met me in a faith community, who took me under his wing, and then while I'm a young 20 something, uh, post high school uh, young man dreaming about going back to college, working in the back of a warehouse, he was the one that says, yeah, not only can you go and accomplish this, but you can accomplish all of your dreams. And he invested in me. He helped pay for my undergrad education. Uh, when at the end of his life, when he passed away a couple years ago, he sent me a text message because he saw me, achieve my Ph.D., start an organization, giving back, and working to help people who are unhoused overcome their struggles. He saw me become a family man. He saw me become an author 5 times over. He saw the way that I was raising my children. And he says to me, "You're one of the greatest investments that I ever made." And I share this story because I'm like, man, this guy developed subdivisions and apartment complexes, and like he was very wealthy guy, but he, on the basic human level, saw the potential of a young black man who was trying his best to overcome, that just needed some extra support. I can talk about all of the people who became community for me that helped me overcome every single hurdle that makes me who I am today.
Wow, man. And that story you just told, I mean, that's a powerful story. It's an emotional story. I mean, imagine losing somebody like that in your life was, I hate to use the word traumatizing again, but
Yeah,
because they meant so much to you, like anybody that loses somebody close to them, whether they're blood related or not, is just an experience unto itself.
yeah, yeah. It not only, Mr. Eason, which you just reminded me that Mr. Eason's impact and investment is present even in this moment. I mean, to be able to have this dialogue about my story in this moment on this, wonderful podcast is important. And it's largely due to men like Mr. Eason, uh, like my mom, Dr. Connie Walker, who refused to give up on communicating to me that education was the way out. I mean, I'm the first PhD in my entire family, and we have to even ask and argue, why is it that educational access to higher education is not as accessible, right,
Hmm.
to people who come from communities like mine? And just thank you. But I also have to. I want to shout out my own father. Even in the book, um, towards the end of my father's life, he passed away last year. Tyrone Lester. He became one of my closest friends. We were able to have some restoration, some repair, and my dad, towards the end of his life, would even tell me how proud of me that he was, and that that my work in the community and all of those things inspired him. And when I think about my dad, he would always tell me, you got to forever forward, you got to keep moving forward. And I write about him even in chapter 9 of the book, how my father and I was able to reestablish a relationship and become close friends. And even in the context of my own life, like, that was resilience, like staying committed, like one step after the other. Just like, I never knew that my commitment to continue to transform and become a better version of myself would even lead to me being close friends with my pops. And so, yeah, it's a story, man.
It is a story, and I imagine it wasn't an easy one. It doesn't sound like it was easy in at all. I mean, that you're talking about just like when you mentioned grit earlier, grit and determination.
Yeah,
That it's not in everybody. There's a lot, and I imagine you had a rough go of it, especially as you decided that you didn't want that life and you were going to fight for something different. And your friends, some of the the
yeah,
family drama, that people that were like, well, we'll see ya, like, that's not what I want. And then you have to then decide, do these people need to stay part of my life or not? And that's really, really damn hard, man, especially if they've
yeah,
been with you your whole time. And you want to try to do better and whatever it is that you want to do, and there's always somebody telling you that you can't, unfortunately. And then
yeah,
you go on and do the thing, and then they don't even know you anymore, or they're taken
yeah,
from us, and it's just
yeah,
like,
yeah,
damn. do
yeah,
you do you remember a time
yeah,
when you're going through all of it where you were like, oh no, I want this? Like like when going back to school was tough, but being in school and then realizing the delight. Do you remember like a defining moment where you're like, oh, I'm not only going to go to school, I'm gonna kick its ass. I'm gonna get my PhD, and I'm gonna do this thing to show, not to show myself that I can do it,
yeah,
that I belong there, and then
yeah,
I will do it. Do you remember that moment?
yeah, yeah. One of the hardest things to do when you are trying to overcome the types of environments that we're talking about is to believe that you are worthy of it. I mean, that's a whole, like, if we just pause and just like really understood
Hmm.
that I'm already deserving. There are many uh, beautiful, brilliant people who are deserving, who are uh, burdened with environments, lack of resources, like all of the things, right? And then you have to do the whole internal interrogation of, like, I don't even believe that I'm worthy of achieving this, because nothing in my life has ever communicated to me that I am worthy of actually doing this. Not the television, not the way that people are talked about who look like me, not any. There's nothing that tells you that you are worth it, right?
Hmm.
That's one thing. And then you meet people who have found that they were worth it, and they used their belief in the power of your 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 brilliance or your potential, and they communicate that to you, and you start to believe them, because the first step to all of this is sometimes you have to borrow courage from other people, the courage
Mm.
that they have in you, the confidence that they have in you, until you have that in your own possession to say like that, yeah, like now I fully believe this for myself. And so yeah, there was periods of isolation where it's like, man, do I continue to take steps forward to change my life? I know that if I am moving forward, that means I'm moving away from certain people, certain patterns, certain choices, all of those
Right. Yeah.
things.
Just got to be
But
just
there,
so hard.
it's tough, man, because you literally have to say, I believe better is ahead in something that I have no reference for
Hmm.
versus what I'm like used to, being around and having access to. And so that was hard. But let me tell you, man, I was working in the back of a warehouse. My now wife of 19 years, she was my fiance back then. I told her, I said, Cecilia, I have a dream. And we were young in our 20s, and she says, well, what is it? I said, I want to finish school, but I don't want to just go back to school. I want to one day start an organization, be in the community helping people. I want to eventually get my doctorate degree. My birthday was right around the corner. You know what my wife bought me? She bought me this plaque right here. It's over 20 years old. It says Dr. Lester, CEO. I keep this with me. This is
Wow.
20 years old. She went to Things Remembered, spent her last check
I remember
getting
that.
this made, and she believed in me long before I had degrees, long before we co-founded the organization, all of that stuff. And then I started meeting other people, and I would just share, and they would be like, yeah, you could do this. And so, it's the decision to say, I may leave this for a moment, but it's only to improve myself to the point where I can become better to go back to serve. And that's exactly what I did, and it took people like my wife and Mr. and Mrs. Eason and Mr. Moore and some of the people that I've met along the way. Dr. Joe, who was a college professor, like all of these beautiful people that came into my life were just nudges along the way. And I'm not saying that this to say that it wasn't easy. I mean, it was easy. It was hard as hell, bro. Like
Hmm.
it was a lot of self doubt. It was a lot of, I don't even know how I'm going to get to school today because I don't have a car. I can't borrow a car from anybody. It was a lot of, I don't have enough money to continue to go. I remember saving up a half of a tuition check and begging the registrar at this small college that I went to allow me to start classes. And then I meet Mr. Eason that comes in and helps, right? It was this taking the step, or the step of faith, and saying, I'm going to continue to pursue this. And no matter what, I'm not going to stop until I become the great. And what I define as great as someone who actually has overcome and is making a difference, because I always had that in the back of my mind.
And people can hear your story, meet you in person to hear all of the things and your advice and your openness, and you're willing to be vulnerable as you have been in our conversation here. Luckily, here in Chicago next Tuesday. You want to say the name of the place one more time and what time you'll be there, and then where can people buy your book?
Yeah. So, man, firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity to share. And
Absolutely.
I am deeply grateful that I'll be in Chicago. And it's Three Avenues Bookshop,
Hmm.
and that's 3009 North Southport Ave, Chicago, Illinois 60657. That's Tuesday from 6:30 to 8 p.m. You could buy the book there, or if you want to get it early, you can buy it online wherever you buy your books from. I don't have a specific spot, but if you do buy it, you read it, you love it, please leave an honest review, because honest reviews helps to get the word out.
Absolutely. And when you are at this event, what can people expect that are gonna they're seeing this now like, well, I want to go. I have questions. Like, what do people can expect for this?
Yeah, they can expect honest dialogue. I'll dialogue with a brother who is leading a work there called Chicago Scholars and working to get educational access for people who come from parts of Chicago where it's not as accessible.
Hmm.
You'll hear my vulnerability. You'll hear what it means to stand in solidarity with people that you may not have the same experience as. Like, how can you support? How can you show up in the school system? What can you do to actually make a difference in real time as things are becoming harder for people and students? So yeah, you'll hear all of it.
All valuable lessons, and I think especially here in Chicago, given the national news over the last few weeks about troops, the National Guard coming in here, and we touched on it earlier. People need to pay attention. People need to know what's going on because if we don't, things will happen once again by a stroke of a pen that could send us off onto a completely different path that none of us want to go down. So, to avoid that and stand up for your community and for your neighbors and for your state's neighbors, like we all are in this together
Yeah.
and we can change it. So, people like you who put this vulnerability out there in the world to be able to talk about it with a complete stranger up until what 40 minutes ago.
Yeah.
I do appreciate you being vulnerable and trusting me, um, that to give you this space to do it. And I am proud to have talked to you, Dr. Terence Lester. Thank you so much.
Tom, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you and keep telling these stories.